What if I told you that ancient Egypt, the land of towering pyramids and god kings, once filled its temples and tombs not just with mummified humans, but with millions of mummified animals? Not a handful, not a few thousand, but entire underground catacombs stacked floor to ceiling with preserved creatures. Cats, crocodiles, ibises, falcons, bulls, baboons, snakes, even fish. At first glance, it sounds bizarre, maybe even grotesque. Why would a civilization pour so much effort into wrapping animals in linen and sealing them in sacred coffins? Were they pets, sacrifices, symbols, or something far darker? To understand the answer, we have to look beyond the gold masks and hieroglyphs. Because the practice of animal mummification reveals something profound about how the Egyptians viewed life, death, and the divine. To them, animals weren't just companions or livestock. They were vessels of the gods themselves. But over time, what began as devotion transformed into an industrialized, almost commercial system of faith. Behind the beauty of the wrappings lay a story of corruption, deception, and one of history's earliest religious industries. Our story begins more than 3,000 years ago, when Egypt's religion was at its height and the boundary between human and divine was blurred. Every god had a form, and that form was often an animal. Bastet, goddess of protection, was a cat. Thoth, the god of wisdom, took the shape of an ibis. Horus was a falcon, Anubis a jackal, Sobek a crocodile, Apis a bull. To see these creatures walking the earth was to glimpse a fragment of eternity. So, when they died, they could not simply decay like ordinary beasts. They had to be prepared for the afterlife, just as humans were. Imagine walking through the great temple of Bastet at Bastet. The air heavy with incense, the echo of priests chanting hymns to the sacred cats that roamed freely around the courtyards. These animals were fed, cared for, and treated as divine emissaries. When one died, it was carried to the temple embalmers, where a ritual almost identical to human mummification was performed. The body was washed in palm wine, the organs carefully removed, the cavity filled with spices, resins, and natron salt to dry it out. Then, wrapped in fine linen, it was placed in a miniature sarcophagus, often carved to resemble the animal itself. Finally, it was buried in vast catacombs dedicated solely to that species, hundreds of thousands of tiny tombs stretching beneath the sand. To the Egyptians, these acts were not morbid, they were sacred. Mummifying an animal was a way to communicate with the gods, to honor them, to ensure cosmic balance. But soon, that spiritual purpose began to evolve. By the late New Kingdom, and especially during the Ptolemaic period, Egypt's temples had become powerful economic centers. Pilgrims traveled from across the country, seeking divine favor, cures for illness, blessings for crops, protection from enemies. The priests had discovered something extraordinary, a business opportunity. They began selling animal mummies as offerings. For a small fee, a worshiper could purchase a mummified cat, falcon, or crocodile and present it to the temple as a gift to the god. Each mummy represented a prayer, a contract between mortal and divine. And the more people believed, the more they bought. Soon, demand skyrocketed. What had once been a solemn ritual for individual sacred animals became a mass-production industry. Priests employed entire workforces of hunters, embalmers, and linen weavers. The Nile Delta became the world's first spiritual assembly line. Estimates suggest that over 70 million animal mummies were produced throughout Egyptian history. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Archaeologists have discovered that many of those mummies were not what they seemed. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when scientists began X-raying animal mummies from museums and excavations, they made a shocking discovery. More than two-thirds were empty. Some contained only bones, feathers, or even bits of straw. False offerings wrapped to look legitimate. Why? Because faith had become profitable. Temples realized they couldn't keep up with the demand for genuine sacred animals, so they began selling fakes. Pilgrims rarely unwrapped the mummies they bought, so they never knew. They paid their coin, said their prayers, and left believing they had honored the gods. The priests, meanwhile, pocketed the profits. But even the deception wasn't entirely malicious. In a strange way, It reflected how deeply Egyptians believed in symbolic power. To them, the form itself, the linen, the ritual, the intention, was enough. The physical contents mattered less than the act of devotion. A mummy didn't need to contain an entire cat. Even a single whisker, or the idea of a cat, could be sacred. Still, beneath that belief, a vast shadow stretched across Egypt's sacred sands. Millions of creatures killed, mummified, or faked, all in service to a system that blurred the line between piety and profit. And somewhere deep in the catacombs, the gods must have watched in silence. To grasp the magnitude of what the Egyptians created, we have to step into the silence of their tombs, not the grand royal chambers of the pharaohs, but the hidden labyrinths carved beneath the desert where animals were laid to rest. The first explorers who entered these catacombs didn't find solemn burial halls or isolated shrines. They found mountains of mummified life, endless corridors stacked with wrapped creatures from floor to ceiling. In 1850, French archaeologists uncovered the catacombs of Saqqara, where they discovered hundreds of thousands of mummified ibises, each one carefully wrapped and stored in clay jars. The air was thick with the smell of ancient resin. Even after millennia, traces of incense and pitch clung to the walls. Nearby were falcons, baboons, dogs, bulls, crocodiles, and shrews, all perfectly preserved. These weren't a few ceremonial sacrifices. They were a production scale that dwarfed anything in the ancient world. Each species had its own sacred site. At Bastet, the catacombs of Bastet overflowed with mummified cats. At Saqqara, the sacred bull god Apis rested in stone sarcophagi the size of chariots, his hide polished with oil and gold. At Tuna el Gebel, the catacombs of Thoth stretched for miles, filled with millions of ibis mummies and mummified baboons that guarded the passageways like eternal sentinels. In crocodile temples along the Nile, priests embalmed hatchlings by the thousands, wrapping them in linen and stacking them in neat rows, like scaly soldiers awaiting divine inspection. But perhaps the most astonishing and disturbing discovery came at the Temple of Anubis, where archaeologists uncovered thousands of mummified dogs, from full-grown hounds to tiny puppies. Some were curled peacefully, others appeared hastily bound, their bodies small and fragile. It suggested something difficult to accept, that many animals weren't dying naturally, they were bred for sacrifice. This was Egypt's divine economy at its peak. Temples across the land had turned their sacred animals into renewable resources. Priests managed breeding grounds where sacred species were raised solely to become offerings. Kittens were born, blessed, killed, embalmed, and sold, all within the walls of the temple. It sounds cruel, but in the Egyptian worldview, this wasn't blasphemy. It was service to the gods. The animals were vessels, chosen by divinity to be consumed by ritual. Their deaths, like grain harvested from a sacred field, nourished the spiritual order of the universe. The process of mummification itself was an art that bordered on obsession. Embalmers followed exact formulas passed down for centuries. First came purification, washing the body in sacred water and palm wine to cleanse it of decay. Then desiccation, packing the body in natron salt to draw out all moisture. The organs were often removed or dried separately, then replaced with aromatic resins and sawdust. For cats and ibises, embalmers sometimes used molten resin to reinforce the wrappings, giving them a sleek, almost metallic sheen. The animal would then be wrapped in linen, sometimes in geometric patterns, sometimes with intricate decorations, and adorned with amulets, beads, or gold foil bearing protective symbols. Each step was performed with chants and prayers. To the embalmers, they weren't merely preserving flesh, they were preparing a body to rejoin its divine spirit, ensuring the god it represented could continue to interact with the world of the living. But what makes this story so haunting is how human hands transformed devotion into commerce. The embalming workshops near Saqqara operated like ancient factories. Piles of linen were stacked high, vats of natron bubbled under the desert sun, and smoke from resin fires darkened the air. Historians estimate that at its height, the trade in animal mummies employed thousands: hunters, transporters, embalmers, priests, artisans, and merchants. And behind the sacred veil, corruption festered. Some embalmers began cutting corners, filling mummies with straw or sand to stretch their profits. Others sold fake mummies to pilgrims who could not afford the real thing. Archaeological scans today show that roughly 1 in 3 animal mummies contained no complete animal at all, only fragments, bones, or even stones. To modern eyes, it looks like fraud. But in ancient Egypt, symbolism mattered more than substance. Even a false mummy, created with intention, could still be an offering worthy of the gods. Still, not everyone agreed. Some priests, records suggest, condemned the mass sacrifice of animals, claiming it desecrated what was once sacred. There were even small uprisings among temple workers when demand grew too extreme. Whispers of starvation among the embalmers' ranks, of animals killed too young, too fast. The temples silenced those voices quickly. Faith had become a business, and the business was thriving. What's striking is how the Egyptian obsession with eternity, preserving the body for life beyond death, expanded beyond humanity. They applied the same logic to creatures of every shape and size, binding them into a vision of the afterlife where gods and mortals shared the same path. For the Egyptians, death wasn't the end, it was a transformation. And if humans could join the gods through preservation, why couldn't the animals who embodied those gods? But centuries later, the desert would betray their secret. As archaeologists opened tomb after tomb, they realized that Egypt's faith in divine preservation had literally mummified an entire ecosystem. From cats to cobras, millions of creatures had been offered to eternity, each one a prayer that no one remembered. By the time the Greeks and later the Romans ruled Egypt, the industry of animal mummification had reached its zenith and its breaking point. What had once been an act of sacred devotion had become routine, almost mechanical. Priests still performed the rituals, but now they did so for an unending queue of pilgrims, each paying for their own divine petition. Warehouses overflowed with wrapped bodies waiting for burial. And as the centuries passed, even the most devout Egyptians began to notice that the gods seemed silent. The collapse began slowly. As Rome's influence spread across the Mediterranean, Egypt's ancient religion started to fade under the weight of foreign rule. New philosophies, new gods, and later, Christianity itself began to challenge the old ways. The great temples lost their funding, the priesthood their authority. Without the constant influx of offerings, the once thriving trade in mummified animals began to decay, literally and metaphorically. But the true death of the industry didn't come from lack of faith. It came from practicality. The land could no longer sustain it. By the late Ptolemaic era, millions of ibises had already been sacrificed, leading to a near ecological collapse. Archaeologists now believe some species used in temple offerings, like the sacred ibis, had to be imported from distant regions just to meet demand. Temples became desperate, killing animals before maturity, recycling wrappings, even filling mummies with fake materials. The faith that once united Egypt had become an engine of consumption. When Christianity spread across Egypt in the early centuries CE, it branded the ancient rituals as pagan superstition. Temples were closed, catacombs sealed, and the once sacred mummies were abandoned to the sand. For over 1,000 years, the animal tombs slept beneath the desert, untouched. Then, in the 1800s, the modern world stumbled upon them and desecrated them all over again. When European explorers first entered the forgotten necropolises of Bastet and Saqqara, they weren't driven by reverence. They were driven by curiosity, greed, and science. To the Victorians, mummified animals weren't holy relics. They were exotic curiosities, commodities to be collected, dissected, or sold. Shipments of them were sent across Europe. Museums bought them in bulk. And what they didn't keep, they burned. It sounds unthinkable, but in the late 19th century, animal mummies were literally used as fuel and fertilizer. Farmers in England imported tons of Egyptian mummies, mostly cats, ground them into powder, and spread them over fields as organic manure. One British paper at the time casually noted, "A cargo of cat mummies from Egypt has arrived at Liverpool, destined for use in agriculture." Thousands of years of faith reduced to ash and soil. The few that survived became specimens in museum collections. But even then, their story remained misunderstood. For a long time, scholars thought they were simply pets buried with their owners, or random sacrifices to appease animal gods. It wasn't until modern technology, X-rays, CT scans, and DNA sequencing that the truth began to emerge. When scientists scanned hundreds of mummified animals, they discovered astonishing details. Some contained whole, perfectly preserved bodies, ibises with folded wings, cats positioned in sleeping poses, snakes coiled in symmetrical spirals. Others contained bones arranged deliberately to mimic the shape of the creature. A few even contained only symbolic materials, mud shaped like hearts, reeds arranged as spines, or small figurines standing in for the real animal. Incredibly, microscopic analysis revealed something else. Some of these animals had been raised specifically for the purpose of mummification. Researchers found evidence of mass breeding grounds, ancient temple farms, where thousands of sacred species were kept, fattened, and prepared for sacrifice. X-rays revealed fractures, broken necks, and signs of strangulation consistent with ritual killing. To modern sensibilities, it's horrifying. But in the Egyptian worldview, this was not cruelty. It was sacred duty. Killing a sacred animal wasn't murder. It was releasing the divine essence within it. The act of mummification then preserved that essence, binding it eternally to the god it represented. Still, one mystery remained. Why so many? The answer may lie in the psychology of devotion. For ordinary Egyptians, life was precarious. Famine, disease, and political turmoil were constant threats. The temples offered something powerful: access to the divine, a chance to bargain with gods through offerings. Each mummified animal was a physical prayer. The more offerings you made, the louder your prayer might be heard. It's a logic that echoes through history. The belief that devotion can be measured by quantity. The Egyptians believed that every cat or ibis mummified was a voice speaking their name to the gods. The millions of wrapped creatures weren't just sacrifices. They were a nation's desperate cry for protection, prosperity, and immortality. Yet buried beneath that devotion lay a profound irony. The very creatures chosen to embody divine eternity became victims of human desperation. The gods had become a market, and for centuries, the desert kept their secret, until the modern world unearthed it, not to worship, but to study. Today, the remains of those mummified animals sit behind glass in climate-controlled rooms. Scientists analyze them with scanners instead of prayers. But if you stand close enough, if you look at their linen wrappings and the faint outlines of their bodies beneath, you might still feel what the Egyptians once felt. A flicker of awe, a whisper of eternity trapped in flesh and fabric. Because for all their errors, the Egyptians were chasing something deeply human, the refusal to let go of what we love, the belief that life, any life, should not end in silence. Each animal the Egyptians mummified carried a sacred identity, part biology, part divinity. To the modern mind, they were just cats, birds, or beasts. But to an Egyptian, they were living hieroglyphs, each one a word in the language of eternity. The cat, for example, was not just an animal. It was Bastet, the goddess of protection, motherhood, and the gentle fire that guarded the household. In life, cats were adored. They roamed freely through homes and temples, their every movement seen as divine grace. To harm one was blasphemy. There are records from the late period describing mobs rioting when a Roman accidentally killed a cat. Families who lost one of their feline companions shaved their eyebrows in mourning, a symbolic gesture to show grief visible on the face itself. When a cat died, it was taken to the priests of Bastet. There, the animal was anointed with oils, wrapped in linen bandages, and sometimes placed in tiny bronze or wooden coffins shaped like a sitting cat. Some were decorated with gold leaf or painted faces to honor their divine status. Entire necropolises were devoted to them, most famously at Bastet and Saqqara, where millions of cats, from newborn kittens to full-grown lions, were buried as emissaries of the goddess. But cats were only one thread in a vast tapestry. The ibis, sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, was another creature of immense reverence. Priests collected ibises from temple aviaries and nearby marshlands, feeding them by hand. The bird's curved beak resembled the shape of a writing reed, the same tool scribes used to record knowledge. In Thoth's mythology, the ibis wrote the laws of the cosmos and kept the balance between life and death. To mummify an ibis was to offer a prayer for understanding, for clarity, for forgiveness of ignorance. When archaeologists opened the catacombs of Thoth at Tuna el-Gebel, they found miles of tunnels packed with ibis mummies, carefully stacked layer upon layer, each one representing a written petition to the god of wisdom. Modern analysis revealed that most were killed at a young age, evidence of an organized breeding system. Yet every one of them, no matter how small, was treated with the same ritual dignity as a human corpse. Then there was the crocodile, the living embodiment of Sobek, the god of strength, fertility, and the Nile's power. Unlike the elegant ibis or the serene cat, the crocodile represented raw, uncontrollable nature. It was both feared and worshipped. In the temples of Kam, Ambo, and Fayum, priests kept sacred crocodiles in pools, feeding them honey cakes and meat. When they died, their bodies were preserved in astonishing detail. Some mummified crocodiles stretch over 12 feet long, their scales polished with resin, their jaws tied shut as if guarding the threshold to the underworld. In some tombs, smaller crocodiles were mummified alongside the larger one, symbolic offspring, eternal families entombed together. Bulls were another divine creature. The Apis bull, sacred to the god Thoth, represented kingship, fertility, and cosmic order. The Egyptians believed that the Apis bull was a living oracle. Its behavior was interpreted as divine messages from the gods. When one died, the entire city of Memphis entered mourning. The bull was embalmed with extraordinary care, placed in a massive granite sarcophagus within the Serapeum of Saqqara, and buried with ceremonies fit for a pharaoh. In later dynasties, Greek rulers even adopted the cult of Apis, blending it with their own beliefs, giving rise to Serapis, a fusion god that symbolized both resurrection and empire. Each animal had its place in the Egyptian cosmos, a sacred pattern that connected the earthly and divine. The act of mummifying them was not random but deeply symbolic. Cats guarded against chaos. Ibises granted wisdom. Crocodiles embodied the primal strength of creation. Bulls represented royal power and the eternal cycle of life and death. But there were smaller creatures too, each carrying its own subtle meaning. Falcons represented Horus, the god of the sky and divine kingship. Jackals, mummified by the hundreds, were sacred to Anubis, the guardian of the dead. Even humble shrews were mummified, tiny nocturnal animals associated with the moon's renewal, symbols of rebirth in the darkness of the tomb. The Egyptians didn't just preserve animals, they preserved the universe itself. Their temples were microcosms of creation, and the animals within them were living manifestations of the gods who sustained it. Mummifying them ensured that every divine force continued to function beyond death. What's remarkable is that this worldview erased the boundary between man and beast. Unlike the Greeks or later Christians, Egyptians didn't see animals as lesser forms of life. They were simply different expressions of the same cosmic energy. The human soul could inhabit a cat, a crocodile, or a bird in the next life. Life and divinity flowed through every living thing equally. That's why the mummification of animals wasn't an eccentric side ritual. It was central to Egyptian spirituality. Each linen-wrapped creature was part of a vast machinery designed to maintain Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. Every offering, every burial, was a small act of cosmic repair. But even the most perfect order decays. As Egypt's faith faded, these sacred symbols turned to dust, their meanings buried with them. Yet, centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered their remains, the Egyptians' message was still clear. The animals may have been silent, but the linen, the amulets, the care, they all spoke of a civilization that refused to accept death as final. In their world, every heartbeat was divine. every creature sacred, and every mummy, human or animal, was proof that life could endure forever, if only you loved it enough to preserve it. When the last torch was extinguished in the temples of Egypt, when the chants to Bastet and Thoth and Sobek faded into the desert wind, the mummified animals were left behind in the darkness, silent witnesses to a civilization's obsession with eternity. For nearly 2 millennia, they waited beneath the sand while the world above changed. Empires rose and fell, faiths collided, kings became myths, and the gods they represented were forgotten. But when their tombs were finally opened again, they told a story far more human than divine. Because the Egyptians didn't mummify animals only to please the gods. They did it to make sense of life and death, to reach across the vast unknown and create order out of fear. In every society, across every age, humans have built rituals to control what we can't understand. For the Egyptians, death wasn't chaos, it was simply transformation. To preserve was to participate in the divine cycle. And what better way to guarantee eternal harmony than by preserving every living symbol of it? Modern science, in its strange way, has only deepened that understanding. X-rays and CT scans have turned the catacombs of Egypt into something like ghostly archives, each mummy a message frozen in time. Scanners have shown the fingerprints of embalmers still pressed into resin, the faint patterns of linen dyed with temple pigments, even the beads and amulets tucked between wrappings as blessings. Under microscopes, scientists have found pollen grains caught in the linen fibers, revealing that certain animals were embalmed during specific seasons, suggesting vast ceremonial calendars, synchronized with harvests, floods, and festivals. Each discovery peels back another layer of mystery and awe. But what truly lingers is not the science, it's the emotion. To hold a mummified ibis or cat today is to feel the pulse of devotion that created it. Beneath the linen, there's no arrogance, no cruelty, just belief. A belief so powerful that it shaped a civilization for over 3,000 years. And that belief, if you look closely, never really died. We like to think we're different now, that our modern world has left superstition behind. But our museums, our cathedrals, even our technology, all are built on the same instinct: to preserve, to memorialize, to defeat time. We embalm leaders, we frame photographs, we store memories in the cloud. We still refuse to let go. The Egyptians simply made their refusal visible, in linen, gold, and resin. In their world, immortality wasn't an abstract dream. It was a craft. They built eternity with their hands, one body, one offering, one animal at a time. The cat that was mummified for Bastet, the ibis wrapped for Thoth, the bull buried for Apis. They were all fragments of an eternal equation. Life offered to death, death transformed into life. But perhaps the most haunting truth lies in what the animals themselves represented. In giving them eternal bodies, the Egyptians acknowledged a universal kinship, that the divine spark did not belong to humans alone. Every creature shared the breath of Ra, the sun god. Every heartbeat echoed the same rhythm of creation. In preserving animals, they weren't elevating beasts. They were humbling themselves. They were admitting that the gods could appear in any form, that the sacred might walk on 4 legs or soar on wings. That's what makes this story so powerful even today. It reminds us that the ancient Egyptians, with all their grandeur and mystery, were not so different from us. They loved, they feared, they grieved, and they longed to keep what they loved from vanishing. They wanted to believe that life, in some form, could be made eternal. And so they filled their tombs not just with kings and queens, but with cats and crocodiles, ibises and bulls, a vast arc of eternity sealed in stone. When modern archaeologists entered those catacombs, they expected to find evidence of superstition. Instead, they found evidence of tenderness. Linen carefully wound around fragile bones, eyes painted lovingly on wrappings, so the creature could see again in the next world. In the silence of those tombs, they found something that transcended religion or ritual. They found empathy, the oldest and most human of all virtues. The Egyptians believed that by preserving these creatures, they preserved the world's balance. And, in a sense, they were right. Thousands of years later, their devotion still lives. Every time we stare into a museum display, every time we marvel at the intricate wrappings, every time we whisper in awe at the precision of their hands. The gods of Egypt may have vanished, their temples may lie in ruin, but the animals they mummified remain. Their faces still peer through the wrappings. Their bodies still carry the scent of the resins that bound them to eternity. They are proof that the human desire to remember, to protect, to hold onto life never dies. In the end, the story of Egypt's animal mummies isn't about death at all. It's about love, the kind of love that refuses to fade even when the heart has stopped beating. And perhaps that's the greatest secret buried in the sands of time. Immortality doesn't belong to the gods. It belongs to those who remember.